Hi, I'm Eve Vogelstein, Great Talk President. On behalf of our board, our partners, welcome and thank you for now being part of this new Maryland conversation, for the joy of talking and sharing ideas with the best minds around you. To our board members, leaders in their own field, and our partners, eminent Maryland institutions from MICA, Maryland Institute College of Art, to Friends School, the Chesapeake Art Center, Blue Rock Productions and Studio, to Loyola University, the Maryland Science Center, Morgan State University, and of course, Maryland Public Television and more. You deserve our most sincere thanks and profound appreciation. I would like to acknowledge and thank our creator, Claudine Davison, for having a vision for these talks, along with our executive board members, Diane Davison and Greg Landry. I also would like to thank the Zaft McKinney Group at Morgan Stanley for their financial support, and the Mid-Atlantic Media, the Strategic Factory, and WYPR for the printing and media support. Tonight would not be possible without the help and support of Blue Rock Productions and Maryland Public Television. Tonight, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the presence of Baltimore County Delegate Dan Morheim, Delegate Danny Stein, and Eva Lewis, Political Director of the Maryland Democratic Party. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. As you know, this is our second live Great Talk panel conversation for the season. I hope you'll continue listening and questioning together at our next Great Talk event on March 20th at Friends School for another forward-thinking topic, Star Trek technology, innovations and ideas for real. And there's a lot more to investigate and to learn on April 24th for truths, myths, and breakthroughs in medical and cancer research at the Maryland Science Center. And the last Great Talk of the season will bring you to the world of music at Morgan State University on June 5th to hear all about music. Into music, the lines, the heat, and the business. Please prepare your questions and answers for the Q&A period after the panel discussion. Everyone is invited to a meet and greet following the Q&A. Please make sure to turn off your cell phones, please. And this evening, we are fortunate to have Lawrence Jackson, whose book is on the short list for the National Pen Literary Awards, the biography of Chester Himes. Mr. Jackson's book will be available for signing and sale. Also, panelist Ernesto Castañeda's upcoming book, Immigration and Categorical Inequality, Migration to the City and the Birth of Race and Ethnicity, will be available for following our talks. On behalf of the Great Talk, I'd like to extend special thanks to Maryland Public Television for being our host this evening and for treating us for refreshments later on. And to MPT Special Events and Outreach Director Kristen Penchik, and to Maryland Public Television President and CEO Larry Unger. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce President Unger, who will introduce the members and moderator of our panel. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Good evening, everyone. We love having you in the building tonight. MPT is very excited to host the second of the Great Talks in its inaugural season. I have no doubt you'll find this evening's discussion of great interest to everyone. I'd like to thank and welcome our esteemed panel for being here this evening. Lawrence Jackson is Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English and History at Johns Hopkins University. He is also an accomplished and award-winning author of numerous publications, including most recently Chester B. Himes, a biography, a July editor's pick by the New York Times, and a Washington Post and NPR Notable Book for 2017. His writing has appeared in Harper's, N+1, Los Angeles Review of Books, and Best American Essays. Please welcome Dr. Lawrence Jackson. Ernesto Castañeda is a social scientist and professor of sociology at American University. Among many roles, he conducts research on migration, urban issues, health disparities, vulnerable populations, and social movements. He compares immigrant integration and ethnic political mobilization in the U.S. and Western Europe and has conducted surveys and ethnographic fieldwork in numerous countries. Please welcome Dr. Castañeda. Joshua Grundleger is a lead analyst for the U.S. team for public finance at Moody's Investor Services. Having covered the U.S. and European countries, including Ukraine, Norway, and Israel, he is currently the regional coordinator for the National Review Institute's Regional Fellowship in New York, and was formerly the editor-in-chief of the SAIS Review of International Affairs. Joshua wanted me to make sure you knew that the views he expresses tonight are his and not those of Moody's. Please welcome Joshua Grundleger. Maryland Democratic Party Chair Kathleen Matthews has worked in the nation's capital and Maryland for 40 years as a journalist, communications and public affairs executive, and Democratic political activist, and is currently the chair of the Maryland Democratic Party. She serves on the boards of Emerge Maryland and Girl Scouts of the National Capital Area, and is active in the Women's Democratic Club of Montgomery County. Please welcome Kathleen Matthews. Moderating the panel this evening is Los Angeles Times reporter Noah Bierman. Covering the White House in Washington, D.C., his stories regularly appear in the Baltimore Sun, as well as other papers in the chain, including the Chicago Tribune. Before joining the LA Times in 2015, he worked for the Boston Globe in both Boston and Washington, covering Congress, politics, and transportation in the immediate aftermath of the Big Dig. Please welcome Noah Bierman. Mr. Bierman, I will now turn it over to you. Once again, thank you all for coming to MPT tonight.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, and I'll speak for the rest of us here. This is a really fascinating topic, so I won't waste much of your time with throat clearing, and I'll try to keep things moving and maybe occasionally pop in the middle of somebody's talk to interject a question or two, as reporters are known to do. And I'll just start with asking each of you a separate question based on this topic to narrow it down a little bit, and also bringing in your expertise if that works for everybody. I'll begin with Lawrence because I'm really interested. I feel like for so many Americans, this is a moment of complete polarization, and it's something I've learned in my reporting, but it's also something I've learned with every single person I talk to in my personal life, and I think all of us probably feel that right now. But I'm curious, it's not the most polarized moment in American history, and I'm curious where you think it fits in on that spectrum.
Oh, that's a great question, Noah. For me, the chief crisis of right now is that we have a, I was gonna in some ways pivot back to you because I was curious what it's like to be a journalist right now when the avenues for good journalism are so narrow. And I think that's what causes our excessive polarization, the fact that so many people are getting news from so limited sources. We used to have, when I was a child growing up, we had a morning paper and an evening paper. We had two papers in the city in Baltimore. And today we have one issue, mainly advertising from my point of view. So if I wanted to think comparatively, I guess I would be thinking about maybe something like at the end of the 1890s. People talk about, not only a gilded age, but an age of yellow journalism. It seems to me like that's more or less what we're dealing with, that we have very, very limited, narrow news sources, and we just don't have the capacity to get the breadth of information that we need. We also have incredible pressures on us at the universities. We find, I went to an emergency session of my professional organization on Friday afternoon, and we had a number of distinguished professors talking to probably 1,000 people. This is at the Modern Language Association annual meeting in New York. And there's, I think, a very salient argument that's being made that instead of, that the professors are failing, and that we need to do more to capture the attention and the imagination of the young people so that they will be invested in taking humanities classes. But as you know, and I think that for my point of view, right, I'm an English and history professor, everyone. I think at Yale, maybe this year, it was either maybe at Yale or Princeton, history has emerged as one of the leading majors. But this would be an absolutely transformative moment, and perhaps, just the single unicorn in the universe of higher education. I mean, we are obviously overwhelmed because of the cost of tuitions and the demands, the righteous demands of parents. I'm a parent of a college graduate, to make sure that they have majors that are meaningful and that will be remunerative upon graduation. But nonetheless, what happens is that we tend to have great flight from the courses that require you to do the most, or to master the greatest breadth in your thinking. Instead, people are directed to really narrow and channel their interest and focus. So in that way, too, I think that possibly we can compare ourselves to some of the perhaps far more narrow academic interest that one might have seen at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, we did have an explosion of land-grant colleges at that time, but again, to take perhaps a fairly narrow course of instruction. There was an explosion of HBCUs at that time, but again, for vocational education. We were emerging from the seminary moment. Johns Hopkins was the global leader for research and sort of the intellectual attempt at the seminar room. But we need to have another sort of transformative moment so that there is, I think, less narrowing, less provincialism, less parochialism, and greater breadth and ecumenical thinking.
Thanks. I think there are a number of issues to unpack there, but we'll go around the panel first before we come back to some of them, because I think the narrowness of choices might be one some of us might debate. But I see where you're going, and so I think that's an interesting line of discussion. But I'll ask Ernesto, what makes an identity? I want to sort of ask you totally disparate questions at first, then we can come back and narrow things. But what makes an identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a definitional question, but it's very important because crisis of identity, identity politics, I think it's good to take a step back and look at this definition. And it comes from students of Freud. Erikson comes with this idea in the 60s about an identity, meaning being the same to oneself. So meaning recognizing Noah as an individual in the world. So that's how it starts, as a very individualistic, very kind of having a consciousness of self. So it starts as a very, again, individualistic thing. Today we see it more in collectivistic terms, like an African-American identity, Latino identities. But that's not the way it was originally conceived. And as a sociologist, I say that our identities, it's a cliche now, but they're fluid, they're changing, so you may have different identities through the life course. And obviously your identity is one depending on your context, right? So here we're speakers, in other places we're professors, journalists, politicians, and some other times we're a wife, a child, a son. So identity is nothing, it's not genetic, it's not something you are born with, it's not intrinsic. So I think we have to be kind of cognizant of this is something contextual. Now, as a national identity, it's a political project. It's always been, right? To create the nation as a reality. It's not something, America is a young country. American borders have changed since the 1800s. If you ask the Catalans or the Spanish or the French, where are the borders of France? They've been changing, right? Who was supposed to speak French or not? Who was a real French or not? These are questions that have been with us since the French Revolution and before. So I think that's the question, not to follow the alt-right or the conservative or this kind of excluding definition of identity, that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you're not a real American. That's the threat. And I think if we fell in that trap, then we're just reproducing and helping them make their argument that they want America to be white and to be truly American means to be X, Y, and Z, and not to be Muslim, not to be this, not to be that. I think that's something that in reality is not true. America is diverse, and it's always been, and it will continue to be. And I don't think we're really in a crisis, although it sounds like it from some politicians, some minorities that are very vociferous and very dangerous, but they're still a minority, I think.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful as we go on, especially this question of a personal versus a group identity and the construct of these group identities, which I think all of us have seen, no matter who we are in our own lives, that fluidity. Kathleen, I want to ask you a more current and maybe narrow question about politics. There's great debate right now among Democrats over the issue of how to respond to the Trump era. And the big question, or a big question that you hear repeatedly, is this question of identity politics versus economic politics, or things that people feel might attract some of the so-called Trump voters, the white middle class voters, and whether there's alienation from those voters over the Democrats' focus on identity. Where do you stand in that, and where do you see that for your state party going forward?
You know, I think one of the things that was so interesting in the last election is that people who were not Trump supporters, people who were Hillary supporters, very few of them knew many Trump supporters. And if you were a Trump supporter, you didn't know that many Hillary supporters. We were very much, I think, isolated politically in this last election. I'm from a family of, I'd say, moderate Democrats and Republicans. I grew up in California. So much of my identity growing up in the 60s and 70s really was defined by my gender, going to an all-women's high school, being part of sort of the cutting edge of women moving into the workforce. And so I very much identified with sort of gender politics, I think. But I have a family that, could go both ways. They could vote for a Republican and Democrat or Democrat, but I didn't have any family members who voted for Donald Trump, even my Republican relatives who didn't. My husband actually is from a mixed family of Democrats and Republicans from Pennsylvania, a little bit more I think, challenged economically where he grew up. And his family was very much divided in that election. So we come out of it and we sort of, I think, those of us who were shocked at the results of that election, I was shocked. I mean, I just couldn't believe that Hillary Clinton didn't win. I couldn't believe that white women wouldn't vote overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. And it showed what kind of a bubble I think I was in. So as a party, I think we're trying to, as you say, unwrap that. We're trying to unpack that whole story. And so what we've been doing in the Maryland Democratic Party is actually listening, sort of trying to be humble about sort of what we know and don't know, and to go out in a state like Maryland and try to figure out what people were thinking and are thinking. And I think our state is really interesting because I think it's very much like the United States. We are a state that has conservatives in Western Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, in Southern Maryland, and then we have this deep blue center that kind of stretches from Baltimore to Montgomery County and Prince George's County, sort of our core, a little fringe of Howard and Anne Arundel County and Baltimore County around the edges that kind of move towards more purple. But we're trying to understand what people are thinking. What were the issues? Ultimately, I think we hear that it was economic uncertainty, economic anxiety that was driving people in their election and their vote. And people saw different answers. Some people saw Hillary Clinton kind of producing continued economic growth and recovery out of the Obama administration. And some said, my situation's not improved enough. It's not working for me. Obama didn't help me out. And they saw in Donald Trump somebody that they thought would provide those answers. So on a political front, I think we find ourselves in 2018 now, going into another election, and trying to avoid sort of a lot of hubris and and overconfidence that Donald Trump has been such a disaster that we can roll back the results of 2016 and have a different result in 2018, to really kind of say, what are people feeling and what are they looking for in their leadership? What do they want to see in democratic governance going forward? And so I think it's really an interesting time right now, because we've got to be careful that we don't find ourselves back in those pockets of just assuming, how could anybody in 2018 vote again for Donald Trump? Because people could if they aren't seeing alternatives that they're looking for or solutions from the other side.
And you're leading right into my question for Joshua, which is about the economy and how much you think economic circumstances contribute to these senses of group identities that people feel and form them to the sense that they're not fixed.
I think it's a combination of culture and economics that have sort of linked up over the past few years to sort of drive what we're seeing in DC, I guess, and the United States writ large. To sort of take a step back, the way I perceive what has happened in the United States since maybe the 60s is that the new left has come out and marshaled a very much of identity politics at the forefront of the political program that's been run. And I think there's some justified reasons for that. I think there was obviously some historical inequities that needed to be addressed, but where the injustice and the issue of identity got mixed up in a way that I think was politically advantageous, but ultimately started to upset a lot of people on the other side of the aisle, both for cultural reasons, but also economic reasons. And this, is largely said people in the middle of the country that, are commonly talked about today, and the sort of the Trump base that has come out as sort of a response in many ways to this cultural and economic trend. So, to be a little more specific, a lot of economic programs to help, poor inner city minorities, but not a lot, at least in perception, done to help the poor rural white. And these together, I think, have sort of started to generate what in my characterization is essentially a mirror image of what the left has been for 50 years. By way of comparison, I think if you look at, say, European cultures, and as Ernesto was talking about, the depth of identity there, much more complicated scenarios. But what you have is that in Europe, you've had a true right wing. You've had that for a long time. And we never really have had that in the United States. We've had the Republican Party, which is essentially a moderate to right party, classically liberal, if you want to characterize it as such, focused on economic policies. The Tea Party, for instance, was very much an economic-driven entity. And they were castigated when they rose up, a few years ago as being this sort of racist, fringe, extreme, organization. And I think that was both to the detriment of the health of the country, but also I think misdirected what a lot of them were really pushing for. It wasn't really about culture. It wasn't about race or gender or anything. It really was about economics and a view of the government playing a certain role, so a political economy. And I think when people saw that movement failed, essentially, there was this sort of angst, and I think that fueled the Trump phenomenon quite a bit, to really say, okay, look, this is the game that's being played on the other side of the aisle, and it works. Politically it works, but we're not getting what we want. And so I think there's a realness, at least in sentiment, to that, what's going on. And of course, all the economic dynamics that surround that. What role is the government going to play vis-a-vis, the poor? And what sort of policies? And now, the way I'm seeing, sort of in a political sense, our parties shape up is it's essentially two parties fighting over for the levers of power. And it's how are we going to use government to help our chosen identities? Whether it's this multicultural milieu, or if it's it's the white working class, And when that comes to, I think, formulate in a deeper way, particularly on the right, that's when you're going to see a lot more clash, because it's going to become a zero-sum game. And if the Trumpian brand of the right is successful in driving out, I think, what I would call the traditional conservative, the ones that have sort of defended a structural system absent of identity claims or special treatment for certain people, you're going to see a very different United States then.
So you think a bigger clash is coming. All right, that's something to think about for all of us, because this feels like we're in a constant clash right now, I think. I'm interested, and I'll start jumping around a little bit here, and feel free to jump in yourself, but Kathleen, you talked about trying to figure out what people want and why they voted for Trump. And Joshua just said he thinks part of it is some racial resentment. What do you think?
I think that the Democratic Party actually kind of grew up representing minorities in many ways, and they were the ethnic minorities that came to our country in the 1800s and early 1900s, and they were largely white, European, Poles, Italians, Irish, and that was sort of the birth of the Democratic Party within our big cities, largely here on the East Coast. And over time, as we continue to become a more and more diverse country, the Democratic Party has very naturally embraced and been a voice for other and newer minorities in this country, and immigrants from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa. And this has sort of created the notion of the Democratic Party as this big tent party. But I think what you've started to see in the last couple decades, and it really sort of came, I think, to impact an election in this last election, was a sense of these previously white ethnic minorities who felt like the Democratic Party had stopped representing or listening to them. Why is that? Folks that had good union jobs, working in ports, working in service industries, working in manufacturing, feeling like the Democratic Party had left them. And they blamed the Democratic Party for that, as opposed to blaming the evolution of our economy and jobs that weren't necessarily outsourced but were replaced by automation, new forms of productivity in the workplace. And so I think they're the ones who felt very left out in the last election. And for some reason, Donald Trump, who has exploited those kinds of workers through his career, who has been pulled through court and had billion-dollar settlements for hiring Polish construction workers in New York City, below minimum wage, working without masks on asbestos, somehow he was able to capture their imagination, their hope. And why is that? Was it because he was that familiar face on television, on The Apprentice? Was it that he just found that dog whistle of message in the campaign that was able to reach them? But for whatever reason, he captured their imagination, he captured their hope, and they thought, you know what? Things haven't been working that well for me under a Democratic administration of Barack Obama for 8 years. This will be my deliverance. And I think that that's where you've seen sort of this big split. And the Democratic Party, I think, has a lot of work to do to go back to those former Democratic voters who would say, my grandfather was a Democrat, my dad was a Democrat, but I have nothing to do with the Democratic Party now. We've got to go back to them and I think unpeel, what is the source of that frustration? And are you really getting anything out of the rhetoric of the Trump administration? For example, on health care. You are someone potentially who was now covered under Obamacare. We have 300,000 people here in Maryland who have health care today who didn't have it before the Affordable Care Act. And what's going to happen to those people under this new Trump administration. First of all, they wanted to repeal the health care. Now they've repealed the individual mandate. We're going to have to try to unpack that with our legislators here as to what the Maryland state the General Assembly is going to do on that, and try to talk to those people to say, really, are you better off with this new administration? And I just think it's a lot of conversation that has to go on. It has to be old-fashioned, person-to-person politics, neighbor-to-neighbor politics that'll start to rebuild that trust by kind of really looking at whether, helping them understand the empty promises of this Trump administration.
I'll ask the same question to Ernesto and Lawrence. Where does this clash over politics, where does the economic issues start and the identity issues end? How can we don't have to frame it this way, but one way is, can the Democratic Party get these voters absent the racial appeals? Or is that part of the package?
I think Trump has been very smart using ethnic identity or immigration status as a wedge to divide people, and it's worked in his populism, and to signal culprits and signal people that are why you lost your job, you're making less money, is because an immigrant is now working under the minimum wage. He's been very successful in making those divisions and pointing things that folklorically, anecdotally, they sound correct. But I would agree with the other panelists that at the end, this is an economic story. And I think that this starts with Reagan in the US, with Thatcher, what we call neoliberalism, or how it was being framed in some areas as globalization, which was not a force of the economy stopped. It was a series of policy choices that were made by leftist parties in the US, the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton. They decided to go that way, and so did the Labour Party in England, and all over the world, they became the fashionable thing to do. Individual responsibility, open markets, trade agreements with little regard for workers' rights, for the environment, bad immigration policies, closed borders. That's not something that starts with Trump. That's something that's going on since the 80s. So this kind of what is being framed by globalization, that some people from the left and labor movements have been attacking for a long time, they saw we're going to be in a moment like this, more inequality, more division, more poverty for blacks, Latinos, and whites, because the jobs have been moved to other places. And it's not like China workers are having great working conditions and great wage. They are also suffering, but we're benefiting from these cheap imports. So it is a restructuring of the economy that happened in the 80s, where both parties, central left, central right, they bought into this ideology, and I think it's still imperant. And now, rather than say, okay, these policies are not working, let's change the economic policies, which kind of was what Bernie Sanders was really seriously talking. Health insurance for everybody. Other countries do it, it works fine for everybody. Let's go back to subsidizing public media, subsidizing universities. These things worked very well in the 1900s. This has really been the goal of Speaker Ryan and people that we want to dismantle the New Deal, and they've done it with the new tax. So they kind of, these right ideological smart group people had this policy agenda, and they have fulfilled it. So it's interesting that even we have the crisis, Obama did great getting us out of the recession, and rather than electing a more leftist government, actually Trump was able to use what was produced by these neoliberal economic policies that create inequality, destroy the middle class, and to use those problems to then create resentment to get elected to do more of the same. So I think that's a big lie that he's done to the American public. And I mean, the evidence, the data is going to be there. So eventually, these white ethnic workers, they see that it's not an issue of identity or race, but it's an issue of class, that they've been taken advantage of by a very small group of people that are going to take more money home. So I think we're going to have to come back eventually to a new deal in 10, 20 years. We have to restructure what it means to be a social democracy, which I think was part of the agenda of Hillary Clinton. I guess he wasn't clear enough selling it, and the Bernie Sanders bandwagon. Some of these is going to come back, because some of them are good policies. But it's very hard to sell them to the American public, which in the media is the cowboy, the independent person, self-sufficient. So there's a cultural issue in that sense of this kind of meritocratic, puritanic, individualistic idea that we have of each other in the media, which in reality is not what we do with our friends, with our families, with our communities. So there's, I think, a very clever playing of Trump to divide people and to distract them from the real economic causes of their problems and point to ethnic and racial divisions. I'll say.
Yeah, I wouldn't be a person who would have like a overly sentimental attachment to the Democratic Party, which I would think of as sort of growing out of a Jeffersonian concept about the yeoman farmer who is supposed to be sort of a fundamental individual in the U.S. And I would only think of it really as having in antebellum era strong center in places like New York. Which, of course, during the Civil War, was always thought of as sort of a copperhead kind of a place, and where you wouldn't have had a great deal of support for some of the most pressing social issues, like the abolition of slavery. I think in the 20th century, we have had two amazing phenomena. The shift of African Americans from the Republican Party in the 1930s to the Democratic Party, which did not go very far at all in terms of providing much of a social welfare net to African Americans, whether it was in mortgages or whether it was in Social Security benefits, from which most Black Americans were excluded. And then in the second half of the 20th century, the shift of Southern whites, working class whites, from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, somewhere between the election of Lyndon Baines Johnson in the contest against Barry Goldwater and then the election of Richard Nixon, where he effectively marshaled logics and arguments of social conservatism, but masking overt racism that appealed to working class whites in the South, and they, in lockstep, joined the Republican Party and have supported its policies, I think, rather blindly ever since. I try in most of the elections, if it's possible, to vote as an independent. I think I wanted to get to something that Kathleen mentioned, and I'll be honest about my source of information. I saw Joy Ann Reid at Hopkins in the fall, and I thought that she presented some very compelling information. She said the Democratic Party today literally is a non-white party. It is the party of American minorities. I don't get the sense in my day-to-day life in Maryland, which is overwhelmingly Democratic, that we have that news, that we have that sense that this is actually the party that is representing another version of America, one that is anathema to very many Americans, and that what is going on the other side of the aisle is somewhat different.
Let me ask about this question of shifting identities, and because I think that's a really interesting one. As we changing so much in this country, as we are in many places majority minority, is that definition itself changing? Is it going to change? I mean, I grew up in Miami, and the term Hispanic is really thrown around a lot, but it doesn't always have a lot of meaning when you think of the different countries people come from and the different interests they have from within those countries, notwithstanding their individual differences that you also brought up. But just as far as group identity, I wonder if you see this country, which still is the biggest collection of peoples out there, if you see our constructions changing in the future on how we count our groups here, so to speak.
They have. I mean, the Irish were meant to be coming from Ireland, and it meant something particular. Catholicism was a bad thing, and they suffered a lot of discrimination because of it. And now they're just white, right? They have this kind of ethnic St. Patrick's Day, and it's folkloric, but it's not a barrier for social mobility. So a lot of groups of immigrants have become white historically. Judaism itself now is seen as Judeo-Christian part of the Western civilization. To be Jewish doesn't have the stigma they used to have. There's still some unfortunately, some anti-Semitism in some areas, but it's seen as part of the white majority, which wasn't historically the case. So what happens with Asians and Latinos is up to us. We could just become the next group of whites 30, 40 years from now. Or if this discourse of difference and all that, we can become more like African Americans. The black experience we haven't been able to transcend that black and white divide. So Latinos, which is a pan-ethnic identity, that a Cuban and a Colombian and a Mexican, there's some differences or similarities, but it's something that's coming from outside or that we construct together. from learning from each other. But this is something that is up to us. It can become something that goes away. And Asians, in terms of income, in terms of education, in terms of intermarriage, like Arabs in the US, they can be indistinguishable. They can be like white. But if you are discriminated, there's a glass ceiling. If there's these stereotypes, you can be easily excluded. So that's what the book of Immigration and Categorical Inequality, it's a lot of examples, historical, contemporary, and in other countries about how these processes are created. And there's particular hiring practices, particular everyday interactions, policies that create these ethnic and racial divisions and make them more real or make them disappear. So it's really something that is in our hands to a big degree in the long term and collectively.
And Joshua, you've studied Europe a lot. I was going to ask you if the constructions there, in your view, are different, similar, and overlapping?
Yeah, I mean, Europe is, I think, much more complex in a lot of ways. I'll answer that directly in a second, but just the U.S. is very much, or was very much, a creedal nation. I mean, this was born as a land of immigrants, and as Kathleen was saying before, there's been a long history of different waves of immigrants, primarily from different parts of Europe and now from across the globe that have come here. And I think what separates, or potentially separates, modern immigration from previous rounds is again this political nature of identity that is, I think, a much more recent phenomenon. When the Irish came, when the Italians came, when the Jews in various waves have come, they've all faced challenges, they've all faced discrimination, but ultimately they were able to become Americans, for lack of a better word, by sort of adopting the creeds and the beliefs that sort of underpin our cultural and our constitutional structure here. And it wasn't necessarily easy over the years. I think the black community, obviously for very different reasons, has a considerably different experience. But today, there's less of a pressure on new immigrants to sort of take their personal identity, as I think has now been treated for the older waves of immigrants, and make it personal. And so there's this sort of multiculturalism in the public space that's very much encouraged. And without passing judgment on that, in this moment, I think a mistake that certainly the left makes is if you are going to continually push this view of thinking about people in terms of certain labels, and you think that's because it's good, well, somebody else out there is going to look at that same way of thinking and think that it's bad, and that's inevitable. So if you want to frame the debate as, or the discussion, I should say, as, this person is this identity, and you could pick a label out of a hat, transgender, female, black, Jewish, whatever, and throw it on them, and you want to help them because of that, and whatever the historical, story behind that is valid or not, you are going to get other people that don't fit those labels or don't like the notion of labels that are going to be upset. And I think that's driving a lot of what we are seeing today. Personally, I'll take a look at these labels and I'll say, by and large, they're meaningless. To say, this person is black or this person is Latino, and that tells me anything about him or her, it's not true. I mean, it's simply not true that you can put a couple of these labels out and tell me what they believe, what their politics are, and on down the list. And I think it does a disservice by sort of, people then feel like they need to flock to some, racial or gender identity, and it creates the divides.
I think you're raising an interesting question, Joshua, because you're putting it in a political realm, which obviously I think our identities are now in a political realm. We have slavery, just to take the African-American experience that you brought up, decades of Jim Crow, systemic incarceration and poverty in cities. Now all of a sudden, somebody wants to come and say, wait a minute, you're no different than anyone else. How's that person supposed to react? I mean, how's that person supposed to say, wait a minute, you're now telling me my blackness means nothing after these hundreds of years when you screwed me because of it?
Right, and at the same time, you haven't, what you've said doesn't describe Barack Obama or his experience, right? Mm-hmm. And he's African-American in the same way.
So, and you're saying that, of course, there's no universal, right? I think we're agreeing with that. But I guess I'm wondering, is there zero value in a racial identity? Transgender, another example, is there zero value in describing a person as that when they have a whole set of experiences, medical, how they're treated in society, et cetera? Is there zero value in considering that as part of their political identity?
You directed it to me, yeah.
But either of you, because you're both, this is the crux of it, right, in the political sense.
There's not zero value in any of this. I mean, because if it's real for someone, then it's real. But I think to jump in with the label first and then ask the question is where a lot of the problem comes in. And I think people need to be aware, clearly we need to be aware of like our history, with slavery and Jim Crow and all that sort of stuff. But that doesn't mean that because you are black, you are defined by those issues. And I mean, there's plenty, and we all can list names, there's plenty of conservatives out there that are black, and they have their ideas formed on their own personal experiences. So yeah, group experiences can be profound, and group suffering can impact an individual, but not necessarily. And different groups can respond in different ways to the same sort of traumas. I mean, the Jewish community, for instance, has, certainly the European Jewish community has experienced tremendous, historical injustice, coming out of the Holocaust and whatnot. And there's a very different mentality and treatment of that, I think, than, say, the American black community. Now, I'm not necessarily trying to make moral equivalence here and play that game. But the point being is, individuals are shaped by broader things. They're shaped by their culture and their families. But it doesn't necessarily need to seep into the political culture the way I think it has in our country. And I think that it's actually causing tremendous harm because people are very much then boxed in to some sort of acceptable list on a paper of this is my skin color, therefore I have to be this way, I have to think this way, I have to associate with these people. And I don't think that's what America is supposed to be. I think we want to take these shared experiences, we want to learn, we want to correct for mistakes certainly, and move forward. And so there is information in all of these dynamics. But it's not the whole story of who an individual is or why they should support a policy in the political realm.
I just want to talk about an experience that I have from the 10 years I worked in the corporate sector for Marriott International, which is a global company in the U.S., 300,000 employees, and employees at all levels. A very, very diverse company economically because you have housekeepers working in hotels in every state in the country, and you have senior executives who are getting executive salaries at the Fortune 500 level. And one of the things that you have heard in the corporate sector really since the 70s is the celebration of our diversity and inclusion. And when we talk about diversity, we talk about the differences. And respecting and admiring and celebrating people for those differences. So that's kind of, paying tribute to the individuality, whether it's as a woman or as a Latino or as an African American, as an immigrant, looking at those differences and saying those differences are great, but very quickly moving into the conversation about inclusion. And inclusion is about the mix, how it all works together. And historically we've talked about the American melting pot or the American stew. I think people have sort of resisted that because they do want to have that individual identity, but we also want us all as a country to work together. And I think one of the places I see it working so beautifully in many ways is in our public schools. It's why I'm such a huge fan of public schools. Last year, I ran for Congress in 2016. I lost. I was trying to figure out, having quit my job, having nothing to do for the first time in 40 years of a career. And so I started volunteering in Silver Spring, Maryland at a Title I school that is extremely diverse. I think they have 400 countries represented in this one elementary school. And the two young children I was tutoring, one was a boy from El Salvador originally, and one was a girl from Ethiopia. And I just watched these kids, and these kids operated in that school as second and third graders, a boy and a girl. not as El Salvadoran or Ethiopian. You know, I watched how they dressed, how the other kids dressed, what they were excited about after coming back from Christmas vacation in terms of the new jacket or shoes. And it was all about the inclusion in that public school and how well that mixed worked. Now, your experiences as you go through life become more complicated. You have things in which your individual identity, your diversity, either empowers you or you feel like has held you back because of how you're treated. And those start to shape, again, your experiences. But I think what worries me most about the Trump administration right now, and you saw this a little bit in the Reagan administration, but I mean, it's just unbelievable what we see today. What worries me so much is sort of trying to destroy public schools and giving people individual choice to go into schools where they'll only be with people who look like them because they can choose to have that experience through voucher systems, for example, and destroying that basis of that public school experience, which has been so great for America. Or to see groups targeted like El Salvadorans who lose their status and may get sent home, or the young dreamers who are now worried about being used as a bargaining chip in immigration reform and sort of what happens with their identity. And I just think that that's what's really scary to me about this time. I studied history at Stanford University. This country has been through horrendous times. And I go back to the Civil War and what led up to the Civil War with slavery and how I can't even imagine what those times were like, or Jim Crow after that, or as you move into the Great Depression and what that was like for the individuals who were trying to make it in this country. I think about what happened through Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society programs and trying to kind of create this level playing field. For me, the Nixon administration was very seminal and how terrible that was, but that was really more about trust in government as opposed to tearing at the fabric of who we are as this diverse country. And now you see Donald Trump, who is this happens every day in a way that you can't imagine, that one day could be worse than the next. And I think it is clawing at this notion of an inclusive society, which we've been building and trying to get better at for so many decades and centuries in this country.
I don't know how are we doing for time? I don't know if I should move to the audience questions yet, but okay. Well, I just want to veer slightly, a little bit away, but from politics, but still using the political frame somewhat, because Kathleen brought up an important point which I observed having covered the campaign, which is, I think it goes beyond politics, is the sense that people who voted for Trump, mostly new people who voted for Trump, they were sure Trump was going to win. The same was true on the other side. And it has to do with, I think, with what Lawrence was talking about with the media, which is, and I might be taking this a different way than you meant it, but the segmentation of how we get our information more and more. We're in different kinds of communities now, and maybe different kinds of identities as a result, and we can even break away from racial and ethnic identities to, you can call them political identities, but you can just, maybe they don't have a name, maybe they're just clusters that we have. I remember during the campaign speaking with some market researchers who gave me some really fascinating information. You tell me the kind of car you have and whether you like Applebee's or TGI Fridays, and I can pretty much tell you who you voted for. How did we get there, and what are these? Are these identities now? Is the kind of consumer choices we make or the Facebook friend group an identity? Anybody take a stab? And
I think it's always been in sociology, in that editor book, we call it categorical networks, CATNets. And this is, sociology is talking about networks way before Facebook and all that. America is an idea, it's a concept, but it's a continent, right? It's from the East Coast to the West Coast. Nobody knows all Americans, it's impossible. Nobody has traveled through all of the 50 states. It's just something that is impossible. It's the media, the institutions, the government that create this idea and this reality of America. But what you do is your school, your neighbors, your friends, that's your real social network. That's who defines your identity, right? You live in Baltimore, in downtown, in the suburbs. That's the people you talk to. That's where you get information about how other people see the world like you or different from you. But you don't really know what's going on in a different state far away. Unless you're campaigning or doing research or listening to people, which is a professional job that researchers, politicians, journalists, we do, but most people don't have the time to talk to strangers about deep ways and about how they view the world. So I think we shouldn't be surprised. If anything, this idea that everybody was watching one news channel at the same time across the country, that was an anomaly that we had only for a few decades and other countries had. But the more channels, the more competition, the more media, people select different things depending on levels of education, on leisure time, on, who listens to NPR, who watches Maryland television, is people that had probably gone to college, people that have bigger vocabulary. So there's going to be some correlations, but I think politicians are sometimes easy to blame the media for this. But another way would be to say just the media is reporting what the different communities are doing. So to say that an American is one thing and an American in Alaska looks the same as an American in Hawaii is, for all purposes, false. But they can agree all that they want a democracy, that they want freedom of the press, that they want freedom of religion, and that's what makes America, these standards. And just let me kind of respond real quick, because this idea of thinking that because we have identity politics as critics call it, or that we have, that we espouse policies of multiculturalism or diversity that are not perfect, but to say that means that immigrants don't want to integrate, that immigrants don't want to learn English, that they want to, because you see them in the supermarket talking Chinese to each other or talking in Spanish. Research shows that they are learning English. It just takes a while. But it doesn't mean that because you know Spanish, you don't know English. That's something that is very dangerous, and that's why the alt-right is saying they want their own country for blacks, they want their own country for Hispanics, we want our own white country, because I hear people talking other languages and this is America. That's very dangerous, and it's false. You can have respect for other religions, for other languages, for other ways of cooking, for other ways of being, and still you can come as a political unity, which is a pluribus unum. So I think the multiculturalism is not destroying America, it seems. It's just respecting differences. But still, who is in power, who is in control, who is the master, the best culture, the best language, the best. This is still white America. That's still the reference. America still means white. And multiculturalism doesn't take away from that, but just says, okay, it's not aberrant that because you are of a Chinese last name, that you can never be American. I think that's what is something better than we were asking before, but we can do it. And it doesn't mean that immigrants or differences or transgender possibilities are going to destroy the core of American identity.
Lawrence, you look like you're ready to say something.
Well, I mean, everybody, I'm sure, and all of us are, sort of have dozens of thoughts going through our minds. I guess listening to Ernesto, I am being drawn more to what Josh was saying earlier, that perhaps there is another kind of conflict that will emerge. And I guess I would just go back to some of the other remarks that I made. I really do think that the struggle that we're having at this point, we're trying to figure out what it looks like to be a non-white country. I mean, for lack of a better word, right? I am one of these people. I enjoy very much the arguments that show in the middle of the 19th century how the Irish became white, what that means, how Jewish people became white, what that monolithic identity meant at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. I teach the classes, and I follow my colleague who passed away last year, Cedric Robinson, and he says that you look at Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, and what you are watching is American History 101 for an immigrant population. That's what it is designed to do. It's designed to give everyone a coherent white American ethnic narrative, right? And we understand ourselves as white opposed to the blacks. What we are having to face right at this point, and we will certainly, everybody understands we're going to get there whether we like it or not by 2050. The world that my son will inherit and his children will inherit will be completely different than the one that I knew, represented by John Wayne on television on Sunday or what have you. And it's going to be a real struggle to get there. It will not be one that will be easy. People will not give up white privilege we were talking about the identities, right? When you are filling out your college application, to Harvard or Yale, what's the identity that you want to be able to claim? Legacy, right? That's the identity that you want, right? That's how you get into the prestigious school. Your parents went to the prestigious school. And who is favored over and over again. So to get beyond that place, it is going to require, some people will not give up the privilege willingly. And I would just also add to the point that Ernesto was making earlier about identities, some people have had the capacity to choose or see, again, possible gain in selecting a particular kind of identity. Power also chooses or calls identities for others, and there's going to be a great tension as people throw off. It's so funny because I feel like I really never say much in public in favor of Barack Obama, but certainly he has enabled generations of young black people to think of the profound, sky's the limit benefits of claiming African American as an identity. Thinking of himself as a person of this soil. Again, not birther. Jackson is not birther, but just as a Hawaiian and the child of a Kenyan immigrant. Excuse me. But this idea that we will be successful in outwitting the identities that have been claiming and delimiting and eliding possibility, I think that will be a big step forward, but it will be one that takes place with the struggles that we're seeing now, the Black Lives Matter movement being one.
Thank you. I think this probably is a good time to open it up for questions if people have them. Please try to keep them more as questions or pithy observations than long monologues.
Hi, my name is Karen Kelly. I'm from Annapolis. And I came here because I'm taking a class at the wonderful Anne Arundel Community College called The Polarization of America. We're doing that as part of our lifelong learning. There is a book that I have read associated with this. I think his last name is Haidt, called The Self-Righteous Mind. Are you familiar with this? Yes, you are. Okay. His point is that the issues ripping the country are moral issues, and his research demonstrates study after study after study that pinpoints 6 moral issues that are embraced by the most conservative people in America, and the 3 that Democrats cling to. So my question is, there are moral histories that come along with all this immigration, including I'm sure you've read the book, The 11 Nations of America, with the description of the immigration. But what about these moral issues? That is, who is a good person, who is a Christian? Christianity turns out to be an issue. What do you consider bad behavior? What is moral? What is immoral? To what extent do these moral differences feed this discrepancy and this polarization that we experience?
Good question. Is there more wrapped up in our clash over identities? Are there other, I think what you're getting at, are there other issues that are not so easy to separate? Maybe that's one of the difficulties I think we all have, and we all have with this conversation, right? How do we really separate? How do we really separate, as Lawrence was saying, the African American experience with Barack Obama, who is not what we traditionally call African, or at least his background is not the same as the people who...
As Michelle Obama's.
As Michelle Obama, yeah, to use some shorthand. Anyone have anything to add on that? Because I think that's a really interesting question.
But I think there's moral issues for sure, and we could talk about the morality of... And there's some policies that are drawn as morality questions, the pro-life or not. But I think that's a trap in a way. I think a lot of the times, this is a Puritan, a very religious country in its founding. But I think a lot of the times morality is used to create social boundaries, to create moral boundaries, right? So the righteous mind is like, we as a group, whatever that group seems to be, we are morally superior to you. Therefore, it's okay that you are subjugated or that you have less money and all that. Or a lot of the times, the things that are seen as morally good are things that a particular class or a particular group is allowed to do, and then they gain a moral advantage after the fact, right? So a lot of the times we criticize African American women because they have children and they are not married, right? But if you look at statistics, they are not the only group that does that, not necessarily negative, but it becomes a moral issue, what is growing also from economic disadvantages. As a bad example. What I'm saying is that, yeah, there's a morality issue of the good versus evil, but I think a lot of the times it's another excuse to divide groups, and again, to say why your group has these boundaries and why you don't allow other people that don't go to your church, because the people in your church, that's the right one, right?
Let me flip that question for Kathleen, if you don't mind. One of the things that I heard a lot of on the campaign trail in various forms and since in other venues is from Trump voters in particular, a feeling that other Americans, particularly Democrats, are too self-righteous. They're casting judgment on them. Is that a problem for Democrats, and how do you address that?
I think the criticism is that the Democrats reflect a cultural elite. That Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party appealed to the cultural elites on the two coasts, you know, the East Coast and the West Coast, and sort of forgot about the middle. Obviously, within the East Coast and West Coast, you have people forgotten, you know, who voted for Trump within those coasts as well. But I think it was a cultural elitism that, for some reason, you know, she projected that Obama didn't project, but comes from a similarly culturally elite background. And is that language? Is it that she kind of projected that she had all the solutions? I feel in one way, one of Hillary's big challenges was she felt as a woman candidate, she had to show how prepared she was to run. And as a result, she had a plan for everything, you know, and her website was chock full of specifics, and here's how I'm going to solve all the problems. And that was seen as know-it-all. That was seen as prescriptive, and they're just telling me how to think. And for some reason, Trump's appeal was more, I love you people, even saying, I love the uneducateds, you know, the uneducated voters. Rather than being insulted by that, people said, he's talking to me. So it was a funny, I think, dichotomy in that. I think it was wrong that it played out that way, but I think the Democrats today have to overcome that. We have to be seen as a more humble party, I think, a party that is listening, that is looking for solutions from people, that is respecting their individual experiences and trying to learn from that to create the right kind of policies that are going to uplift people and create opportunity.
How do you balance that, though, between the sense of, I don't want you wagging your finger at me, with the sense of, you want to give voice to real grievances, for example, right now that a lot of women have in the workplace? How do you balance that? Because that's not going to please everybody.
I think that is the incredible challenge that we're facing right now. I mean, I think that parties, I think, have to be seen as true, honest advocates and brokers for people's interests, and how we get to that place. And I think it's coming, I think it's the search for authenticity again. Otherwise, if we don't find that, I think our political parties are going to be very, very challenged. Right now, I think the Republican Party is equally challenged. There is a party of Trump, and then there's a Republican Party. And we're trying to reconcile that. So I think we have to get back to that. And, you know, I think both the parties, Republicans more so in other eras, the Democrats now seen as being institutional, big dollar raising, kind of aloof entities, you know, and that's why I think it's exciting to be in local politics now. It's exciting to be in state politics now, because it's an easier connection person to person, and to find that authenticity of being people's steward, broker, you know, representative.
Joshua, you had something to add?
There's a lot of truth, I think, in what Kathleen is saying here, and not to, you know, talk about Clinton. I think it's broader than that, and it's broader than the U.S. You know, Brexit is I think the easiest example, but there's examples across Europe where this same phenomenon, these same sort of cultural pushback against this, this perception at least of elitism and centralization in either DC or Brussels. So I would argue that this is more of a Western civilizational trend that's going on. It's not, Clinton I think made her mistakes, and I think Kathleen hit on some of those, but it would have been anybody almost in that position, and maybe she was the least prepared person to respond to what's going on in the broad sense. But the pro-Brexit movement was very much of the same mentality, and obviously Clinton wasn't there, and it wasn't a woman issue in Britain. It was this economic and I think cultural movement and resistance against the centralization of political decisions that impact individuals' lives happening in a far-off capital. And I think that goes hand in glove with this notion of elitism, and there's a professor or there's some panelist, speaking down to me. And this, you could see the language of this, in the Obamacare debate with the death panels. And just that sort of notion that, I don't want somebody else making decisions. Again, whether the policy is actually that way or not is a separate topic. But that sort of broader trends, I think speaks to maybe not moral issues per se, but at least political economy issues that are really widespread.
Have any? Yes. Or I guess the mic man needs to come to you. Well, I think the woman in the blue jacket, sorry.
I didn't see who you pointed at. Thanks very much. I'm Ellen Silbergeld, and this is really interesting to me because it seems to me there's so many things not being mentioned here. And the person who came closest, I thought, was Professor Jackson, where you talked about, in a way, the crisis of the humanities and the loss of a kind of sense of purpose. I'm at Hopkins too, but I'm one of those bad STEM people that are luring all the students away from the humanities. But I'll tell you the things I haven't heard. From my own personal experience growing up, and also what I observe, I think the foreign policy of our country has been immoral for the past 50 years. And we've really lost our way. We've lost all our credibility and all our moral standing ever since Vietnam, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. What else do I need to mention? Bombing in Yemen. So I think we've lost something that gives us less of a foothold on our own country and less confidence in ourselves. The other point I wanted to make, which I think you made, is that, this business of the Trump taxation, this is an old story. The rich have gotten richer. The divisions between the top 1% and the bottom 60% have been growing for the past 30 years, I think. And we've had a tax system that perhaps wasn't explicitly so corrupt, but it certainly nodded and winked, as we know from the Panama Papers and a variety of other disclosures that we've had. So that's all corrupt. And we've lost the leadership of the humanities. And then, may I mention one thing? The opiate crisis. A great deal of this country is desperately sad and has lost all hope. And we're kind of skating around these huge social movements, which are going to disrupt any sense of identity and certainly make it very difficult, I think, to get back on track.
So, does anybody have anything to add to that? I think that's a good distillation of a lot of people's frustrations, maybe, for lack of a better word, transcending the identity question, or at least playing into that.
It might be connected to a question I wanted to ask Kathleen, and I, just sort of forgive me for putting you on the spot. But I wonder if you think of your colleagues in the the upper echelons of the Democratic Party as being more comfortable with Donald Trump as president than Bernie Sanders as president. And I think that, sort of in choosing from among elites who, stylistically may be quite different, but in terms of a lot of nuts and bolts seem to me to be profoundly similar. American foreign policy, which tends not to shift at all, depending upon which party is in the White House. And I wonder if the real threat to what seems to be underway now is coming from, I don't want to say from the independents or the independent party, but certainly from people who have different kinds of ideas. And I would also like to say that one of the things that I am hopeful about is that we will, in the United States, try to disaggregate ourselves from this idea of the global West. I think that that's really a problem for us, and that it limits us and what our future capacities might be. But to the question about the upper echelons of the Democratic Party and their comfort with Trump over Sanders.
I can't imagine any members of our federal delegation here in Maryland or any of our state delegates that would prefer to have Donald Trump over.
What about your funders? Your financial contributors?
Well, financial contributors to our Democratic Party include most of the major unions, individuals who identify as Democrats. They identify as Democrats because they think historically the Democratic Party has represented a pathway towards opportunity and a more level playing field, and really focused on the horrors of income inequality. And so that's why I'm a Democrat. I'm a Democrat because I think you should have a tax code that enables you to create opportunity and lift more people to create a more just and equitable society. I'm a Democrat because I think the Democratic Party really believes that women should get equal pay for equal work. I'm a Democrat because I think the Democratic Party has been the party of civil rights. The Democratic Party is not perfect, but we are trying to create a more perfect union, I think. I don't see it as, I see the Republican Party as the party of special interests and the elite economically. And that's what I think that this tax bill is showing. So I know why I'm a Democrat, and it's why I am in a full-time unpaid job now, because I'm very purposeful about trying to rebuild a Democratic Party that I think really will help us get to a more perfect union.
The question over here, I think was next.
Thank you. Dan Morheim. I'm a state delegate from this district with my colleague Dana Stein. I'm an emergency medicine physician when I'm not in the legislature. And I was going to say something about the tax structure, but that finally got mentioned. I was going to say something about the opioid crisis, but that got mentioned. So let me go back to the opening issue of how we talk to each other. I do try to read as my daily activity all the major news entities, including Fox News online. And what I see there is so totally different from the other news that's reported. I actually subscribe as a moderate Democrat to various right-wing blogs to try to understand what's going on there. And but the thing that I want to speak to is really what's become the lack of civility due to anonymity. People can say and do anything now, and it just has gotten to a point, reading some of the comments, that there's such a orthodoxy and non-tolerance for people who have slightly different points of view that I'm really concerned about how we are going to bridge some dialogue to any kind of common ground of even basic facts, let alone differing opinions. And that's one of the struggles that I'm trying to understand. By the way, I really appreciate this discussion. Thank you for hosting it. Thank you for being here. I think this is the kind of discussion we need to have more of. Because identity is a struggle.
I'll add something to your civility question, and feel free to chime in as well. But definitely in covering politics, I hear a lot of incivility, but I also do hear a lot of these calls for civility. And one of the very interesting things in covering the Trump campaign was there was, as you know, because it's continuing today, but it began during the campaign, a great hostility toward the media from Trump supporters, a lot of chants of CNN sucks and that sort of thing. And you mentioned how anonymity aids some of our incivility. I would go during the rallies to speak with people individually to ask them to express their concerns, tell them I was from the Los Angeles Times, which was sort of in the frame of the mainstream media they were criticizing. And they'd say, sure, what do you want to know? I'll give you my name, I'll give you my age, I'll give you all my beliefs. The friendliest people you can imagine in the one-on-one setting. And, I think obviously we have big crowds, chants, you get excited. And now we have this added ability to go online and find people of like mind in a setting where you don't feel a personal responsibility necessarily for your comments. And it is an interesting phenomenon. I don't have a ready solution here, but it's just an observation to add on to that, and perhaps just sort of more engagement at the personal level, and maybe more breaking the bubbles that Kathleen was talking about, just to try to talk to people who didn't vote for the same person you did for a state or national political race about why and what's motivating them. Try to divorce it from the personalities maybe and more onto the issues that motivate them, because certainly the issues that you two mentioned, the opioid crisis, rich-poor gap, those things, those are universal concerns right now, right? They're very big, and they seem to transcend a lot of identities for people. Yes, unless somebody else, yes.
Make a quick comment on that. I think there's at least three things that I see sort of feeding this incivility. I mean, there's technology, right? The internet itself is a tremendous benefit, but it's also a tremendous curse in that it allows us to sort ourselves very easily in addition to the anonymity. I think there's also the growing trend that everything is becoming political. And from my political perspective, it's the growth of the federal government is contributing to that immensely, in that the more policies that are decided in Washington, the more you and I have to fight over who gets to decide what that policy looks like. Whereas a traditional sort of federalist approach, where a state or a local government maybe has more of a say on certain policies, healthcare, for instance, we can each figure out different things in different areas and sort of live next to each other and be happy and not try to control each other. And I think that trend has amplified, and it has created more grounds for people to fight. And it goes along with sort of the third trend, which is I think that the parties themselves are becoming much more ideologically divided, where historically it was more regional and there was other interests at play that you had conservative Democrats and you had liberal Republicans, and both of those are basically extinct now. And I think these other trends are driving that. But that then creates politics and political campaigns where it's the objective is to demonize the other side as being some evil monstrosity that hates everybody, that looks like us, and that just then these all sort of rotate together and they fuel each other. And if that cycle isn't broken, and I don't know the answer, but I think if it's not, you slowly move into warring camps.
Final question over here.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Camilo Romero, and no doubt that these sessions are necessary. It's unfortunate some of the policies we talked about strip the funding to have this come to broader audiences. And I wonder, some of this sometimes sounds like first world problems, but I recognize, and I'm glad that it was put in a global context. I live and work in Colombia where we're helping with the peace process, and the same issues of who belongs in what conversations is very pertinent. And there's no doubt that this may not reach much farther than those that are in this room here. Hopefully it's publicized at future forums or put on public television itself. I wonder, however, what message do we give to the young folks who may wish to be a journalist and can't afford it, who may wish to study at Stanford or work at Marriott and can't afford it, or be a tenure-track professor and not afford it? That to many, and I include this from a local context as somebody who studied in the US as well as somebody who has a global life, I wonder if there actually is a silver lining. What do we give? I know there are some young folks behind me, because usually it's more of an adult problem. The incivility, the distrust, the despair, the opioid crisis is often not amongst us young folks, the young Salvadoran and Ethiopian second and third graders that Kathleen mentioned. we're actually modeling that. And Trump doesn't worry me as much as the example that each of us, and I include myself, are giving to those that are coming after, right? The fact that we can point that, I can't believe you voted for Trump, or how dare you even vote for Hillary, or I'm glad we just even voted, right? Where in my country, 33% of the population voted for the peace process. The other 66 never didn't come out to vote. And I wonder if there's a takeaway that each of you or individually could offer as what we're actually giving to those that are coming after, since they're the ones actually inheriting all these problems.
It's like you were planted here for the concluding question. It's perfect. It's perfect. Joshua, you want to give it a start here? We'll go down the line here.
Yeah, lucky being the first one on that one, but you know, it's tough. I personally think we're doing a lot of destruction to our civil society, to our culture, and I think, you know, I guess the problem as I see it is a lot of short-termism. Let's win the media cycle, let's win the next election, and I'm willing to sort of throw everything out on the wayside. The other half of it, I think, is just education, for lack of a better word, and not in the academic sense, but, you know, why do certain things exist the way they did? Why do we have certain, you know, structures in our government or within our society, and why should we adhere to those norms and those behaviors, despite the fact that it might be sort of costly in the short run? And I don't think, you know, we're doing a good job of teaching, you know, our children, for instance, on how to sort of behave in the public setting, you know, and, you know, again, it comes back to the other points. It's the Twitter world, right? You know, you have to get an idea out there in 140 characters, and that's the end of it. And you got to win, and you got to get retweets and whatnot, and that's, you know, yeah, it wins maybe elections, and it wins, you know, the eyeballs on your Twitter page or your blog, but, you know, it is destroying America. And so I think we need to sort of step back and try to reverse that trend and sort of say, you know what, I don't agree with this, but I respect that. And, you know, just as sort of an aside, Alan Dershowitz, who I think was a big Clinton supporter, came out recently with sort of this criticism, not to go into too much depth about this topic, but of these calls for, you know, impeachment or removing Trump via other constitutional mechanisms, and saying it's crazy. You know, we can't declare Trump is insane, essentially, what the process would be, that he's, you know, mentally unfit for office. Like, because we have political disagreements, we have to, you know, ostensibly fight them then on political grounds and not sort of institutionalize. And I think that, you know, it's sort of there's people out there that are putting these brakes on this sort of, you know, win political fights by any means. And, you know, hopefully more of those have sort of the courage to come forward.
Yeah, again, fantastic question, and just powerfully reorienting us. I think that we have to try, and we've already mentioned humility. We have to show a great deal more humility. I know that the audience were from all over the state, and I know a bunch of people have said they're from Annapolis, but no one can sort of sit here on the outskirts of Baltimore City and say that an opiate crisis is something that's new. I grew up in the city. I started going to public school in 1972 in Baltimore City, and certainly the opiate crisis is something that I have been intimately familiar with and living in for my entire life, and certainly my adult life. The same would be true for the epidemic levels of street corner violence that the city is internationally known for at this point. And these are crises and social problems that are of great international import and will have a great deal to do with how our civilization unfolds. So unfortunately, it is also our responsibility and burden problem, if you will. The children huddled at the Calverton Middle School and at a couple of the other elementary schools in their coats because there's no heat in our public school system. I too would like to see our public schools flourish. Practically, what I'm trying to do, you said Camilo. Practically, when I came back to Baltimore last year, or started teaching last year, trying to launch something called the Billie Holiday Project for Liberation Arts. And it's really a simple idea, or two rather simple ideas. One thing that I'm trying to do is to collect or preserve or be a custodian for local archives. My research interest is African American life and history in the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries. So we're trying to make sure that the historical record is preserved, the one that's in private hands, that's in the hands of small churches, social clubs and groups, and that also impacts or connects to the larger institutions in the city, my university, other universities, historical societies, and the like. The other thing that I want to do is to try to open up the resources from the, well, certainly the wealthiest research university in the region, and so that we can do more sharing from our Ivy Tower in Homewood, and take some of these resources and make sure that they go out to other parts of the city that are often, sort of on the other side of what is essentially a barricade. If you go to the campus, you see they're not armed guards, but the campus is sort of protected, if you will, by a gendarme on every corner. And I've been taking graduate students and undergraduate students, to high schools, churches, libraries, and to present their research, and with the hope that it will be an open circuit and that other parts of the city will be able to use the wealth that's there on the campus. And as you may know, or as perhaps some of you do or do not know, the original bequest by Johns Hopkins in 1876 was to found a university, but also a colored orphanage and a training school for black girls. And it was about 1922 or 1924 that the training school closed. I don't think that the orphanage survived the 19th century, but if we want to think of ourselves as carrying out the mandate of Johns Hopkins with the original bequest, he was very concerned about poverty, especially black poverty in the city. Baltimore had the largest population of freed people prior to the Civil War. So anyway, small steps to be sure, but nonetheless ones that may be enduring possibly.
Well, we face a lot of challenges and divisions, and there's some issues to work on and be passionate about and work on the political arena. I'm on the overall positive. I think looking at students in my college classes, the women don't feel intimidated speaking in class. I think we still have a long ways to go. We should have equal pay. But in the classroom, they show every day that they are as capable or more than their male colleagues. You can have people from different backgrounds, and they're doing well. They're very open to challenge the professor, which I think is good, that they challenge authority. There's difference of opinion, different ideologies, and they try to discuss them. They don't convince each other, but that's fine. There's debate that we're having right now. Looking at my kids' schools, public schools, completely diverse. So I think we actually, rather than teaching them, and I'm a professor, so sometimes I teach younger adults how to see the world, how to think critically about it. But I learn a lot from my students, and I think whatever age we have, we can learn from younger people, because they have figured out these problems, have to deal with bullying in Facebook. This is their high school lives, so they can teach us about how representative these bullies are, or how these trolls, how not to feed them, how not to take them seriously, because they have figured it out from a younger age than we do. People that are LGBT can come out of the closet younger than before. So I think there's some progress, there's some things that we have gained that we can continue. So although there's challenges today, I think because of the future generations that you were mentioning, Camilo, I'm very optimistic. I think they're going to figure it out, and they are figuring it out today.
I'm also a glass half full optimist, and your country is a great example. I mean, think about what has happened in Colombia, and the adversity that your country has come out of, and how you've rebuilt it economically and politically and everything. So I see periods like this producing the opportunity for us to be better. And I've seen that in my own lifetime, coming out of college and going into journalism and television news. And when I first got there were very few minorities and very few women. The anchor desks were all white men anchoring the news. And by the time I left, you wouldn't ever consider having a news team that wasn't diverse by gender, by race, by sexual identity. And so you see that on television every night. Television news now reflects the people who are watching, the audience. Similarly, in my career at Marriott International, when I moved there, I was the first woman to report to the CEO. And there were no African Americans, no Latinos. By the time I left, it was a much more diverse C-suite that was representative of a company that was very, very diverse. And I saw that evolution, just in this century, from early 2000s to 2015. And when I think about the young interns that come and work for us at first in television, at Marriott, now at the Maryland Democratic Party, the diversity and the optimism of those young students, people who want to be journalists today. I mean, we talk about sort of how bad the media is because of the anonymity of the web and websites, but we're having a renaissance in reporting right now. I mean, the kind of reporting that's happening out of your newspaper, the New York Times, the Washington Post, this is Watergate era caliber, great reporting. And I think it will prevail. And I think institutions like the FBI and the special counsel will prevail, just as they did during the Watergate era. So I'm optimistic that we are going to be moving to a better place because we're talking about these issues. Gay rights, unbelievable progress in our short period of time. Who in this room would have thought we would have gay marriage in our country at this point? So I just think that it's always evolving, it's always getting better, and I think our children see that in their own lives. My kids are growing up, they're all in their 20s, and they're growing up in a very different environment than I did. And I think it's a much better place and will continue to be so.
Thank you, and I'll give a brief, hopefully optimistic account as well. I was here 3 years ago for horrible circumstances, not quite 3 years ago, but the racial unrest that was gripping this city, to cover it, and covered one of the most unusual things I've ever covered, a baseball game with no fans in it. And this was because, touching on a lot of themes that we talked about, the corporate elites had to prevail and have the baseball game because money was on the line. But this was the great American pastime, and it was considered too dangerous to have a game with the actual people of the city there to interact because things were so bad. And there was debate whether this was the right decision, but very, very uncomfortable feeling, very eerie feeling to hear all these sights and sounds of a baseball game, even the organ playing the music for each player as they came out, the announcers having the seventh inning stretch, all these things going on with a ghost of a stadium here, and a completely depressing sight, symbolically and otherwise, for me as a reporter. I've come many times. I live in D.C., it's not that far, but I was able to come a year later for a cultural celebration with my children at a museum. I can't remember which one, but it was I think it was a Martin Luther King Day celebration where they were doing arts and crafts, and I brought my kids, and my wife and I came. And you saw the whole polyglot of the city together again. And I know that the problems weren't solved by those kinds of events, but it is a glimpse into what is possible. It is a glimpse into the idea that the Pope talks about of encounters being crucial to these questions that we're facing in these crises. So that's my optimistic note to leave you on, even though I'm simply your detached moderator here. But thank you all.
Thank you very much. Want to thank you for a wonderful evening, and all of you who came to join us tonight. We really hope that you have a lot of food for thought. I want to remind you, our next talk is on March 5th at Friends School, and the topic Star Trek Technology, Innovations, Ideas for Real. If you found this fascinating and exciting, I invite you to come and have your friends come too. Please tell them. I want to thank once again MPT for hosting and being really wonderful. And we have refreshments in the back for you, and I want to thank the volunteers too. I'm sorry? Yes, I was going to say that exactly. In the back, we have our books for Lawrence and Ernesto, and to talk and discuss. Thank you again, and have a good evening.